Motion be agreed to. Ian Lees-Galloway.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Labor continues to support this legislation because it does remove the untested drugs from the shelf and it also precludes animal testing from being used to prove that psychoactive substances are either low risk or no risk, and those are two policies that we wholeheartedly endorse. So there's been a lot of debate this evening about who voted for the original legislation and why people voted for the original legislation. This should not be misinterpreted as overturning the original legislation. This amends the original legislation. It takes out the transitional provisions of the Psychoactive Substances Act and it precludes the use of animal testing, which was already somewhat restricted in the Principal Act due to a compromise position that was able to be reached at the Select Committee. So this should not be interpreted by the public as somehow overturning that overwhelming vote in favour of the original Psychoactive Substances Act. And I just want to respond to John Banks because he seems quite tickled with himself that he was the one MP who voted against this legislation. He then went on to say that somehow or another voting against the legislation meant that he was saving youngsters from using these drugs, from the perils and dangers of these drugs. Well, let's be really clear here. If Parliament had followed John Banks' lead on this legislation, all the drugs that were out there before this Act was put in place and all the ones to which temporary ban notices had been applied would still be out there. Something between 200 and 300 different products. We had so little idea about what was out there, we don't even know how many drugs were on the market, and we have no idea how many stores they were being sold from. It could have been 3,000, it could have been 4,000. On the day that the Act was passed, we went down to 47 drugs on the market, and we went down to around 160 licensed retailers. That was the impact of that Act. So imperfect as it was, as much as we're back here, as we predicted 12 months after the original first reading, trying to fix it up, it was a vast improvement on what we had before. And for John Banks to get up and crow about how his vote against the original legislation was somehow protecting the youth of New Zealand, I think is bunkum, and it needs to be called out for what it is. John Banks seemed... look, John Banks loves animals, and he prioritised the protection of animals over the protection of kids. But in fact, look, there was more than one way to deal with this issue. And although the National Party blocked the amendments that would have dealt with animal testing at the time, those of us in the opposition who actually cared about protecting our youngsters from high-risk drugs said we would pass the legislation regardless and we would find other ways. And Trevor Mallard offered a supplementary order paper to the Animal Welfare Amendment Bill, and that is one mechanism by which we've been pursuing this, and today we're finally going to get there with the mechanism in this bill. So the principles behind the Act were still sound. It's just the implementation in a lot of ways that's been poor. And we've talked about how it's taken a long time to get the regulations in place, and therefore the untested drugs have stayed on the market for much, much longer than I think Parliament really anticipated. When we passed this Act, we were being told by the government and by the advisors that this was going to take the high-risk drugs off the market. And we were told that the transition phase would be short, and that it would be dealt with before now. And that has been one of the biggest failures, getting the regulations sorted out, which of course we've discovered is in part because of the Prime Minister's discomfort with animal testing, which could have been dealt with if the National Party had voted for Mojo Mather's amendment in the first place. The other question which is now in front of us, and this goes to implementation and resourcing as well, because we've heard about how there's half a dozen people in the Ministry of Health trying to deal with all the licence applications, trying to deal with writing the regulations, trying to deal with the complaints about different substances. Half a dozen people simply has not been enough to implement this legislation properly. But there's the other question, which is how well resourced is our addiction treatment sector to deal with the potential for a large number of people coming off these drugs. Now, I'm going to be honest, we don't know what the impact is going to be. Some people might be able to come off these drugs and have no need for addiction treatment services. There may be a flood of people accessing addiction treatment services. there's no way the government's going to be able to step those up to respond to that crisis, because we simply don't have the trained people out there, and addiction services don't have the resources and will not be given the resources to respond should there be a flood of demand on those services. But the other thing that's been missing in all of this is information. Information for families, information for users. I was talking to someone in my electorate the other day who works for Youth Justice, who was telling me that the young people that she deals with were actually telling her which products were which ones were the bad ones, what the effects were of them. She said, "We've gathered all this information." I said, "What did you do with that information?" She said, "Oh, we didn't really know what to do with it. We haven't passed it on to anybody." She didn't know. This is someone working for a government agency who didn't know that what she should be doing is passing that information on to the Psychoactive Substances Authority so that they could be making decisions about which products needed to be recalled. That is how poor the information has been from the government for how to make this act work properly. So it is important, as we go through this next phase, that the government ensures through the DHBs that families have information for how to support people coming off these drugs and how to support people who are addicted to these drugs. That information simply has not been available, and that has been a lot of the cause of the community outrage, because people haven't known what to do. The government has not run any programs. There's been no social marketing programs to tell people how to report the harmful effects of psychoactive drugs. There has been no program to teach people what low-risk use is of these substances. It wasn't enough to pass the legislation. It had to be implemented properly. Our Ministry of Health had to be resourced properly. Our district health boards had to be resourced properly. Our addiction service treatment centres had to be resourced properly. Our public health services needed to be resourced properly. None of that has happened, and that is another reason why this Act has had a really unfortunate start. And that's why we're back here trying to tidy it up again. So we do support the amendments in this bill. We do think that they will tidy up some aspects of the Act, but the government needs to do a lot more. It's not just about passing legislation. It is actually at the feet of the government to make sure the resources are available to make this Act work properly.
Dr. Paul Hutchison.
Thank you for the opportunity to take a